Hi, I'm Bob McCoskrie, and my guest this morning is all the way from Ireland. I hope I said that okay. It is Stella O'Malley, who's a psychotherapist and also an author and the founder of Genspect, which we'll find out a bit more about. But Stella, welcome to New Zealand. It's lovely to have you on this interview.
It's lovely to speak to you.
Stella, you sort of came into the public focus because you made a submission against the Conversion Therapies Bill, which is currently going through Parliament. And, well, you caused a bit of a stir, actually. You caused a bit of a bun fight amongst the politicians as to the true effect of the law.
That's a completely erroneous interpretation of the law by Lewis Wall. On the plain words of this bill, what you were doing would be captured by the bill.
No,
Absolutely.
no way.
It would. And I don't, we could argue this. Stop putting your contestable view of what the law says with zero legal expertise in front of the committee, Lewissa.
But I was fascinated by some of the background information you had, and I thought for our audience it's important that they understand a little bit more about this, what we might call a transgender trend. But let's go back a little bit further. And can you just tell us firstly how you got involved in this?
I can, and I'm glad I've caused any sort of discussion in New Zealand. I do note that the New Zealand conversion therapy ban is the very same as the one in Ireland. And it feels like these bans are being kind of driven around, pushed out around the world without very much nuance, without very much intelligent conversation. So I'm delighted that there's beginnings of debate and kind of thought around what is the most appropriate way to support gender diverse children. So as a child myself, I experienced a very intense kind of feeling of not feeling that I should be a girl. I was born a girl in 1974, and from as far back as I go, so around about 3, I thought I should be a boy. I knew I should be a boy. I thought I'm better as a boy. I very much identified as a boy, and I became like a very well-known unusual kid in the town. And you know, the psychologist Ken Zucker said, you know, when a child has gender dysphoria, the whole town knows it. Well, the whole town knew it about me. Like, I was very definitely, I'm a boy. Everywhere I went when I was a kid, I used to be asked, are you a boy or a girl? And I'd kind of often say a boy, and I often just say no, whatever that meant. I think I must have been kind of non-binary before it existed. And, you know, weirdly enough, I had an imaginary friend when I was a kid who was neither boy nor girl. So I was really involved. I was really into it. And I was the only kid. This was back in the day. And, you know, we wear school uniforms in Ireland. And the girls wore skirts and the boys wore trousers. And I wore trousers. And I was the only kid in the school who wore trousers as a girl. I really, really was deep into it. And I look back and I hated being a girl. It just felt really uncomfortable, didn't like it, and just thought I'm much better as a boy. And I get it. Even now, to this day, I can see how somebody as, I don't know, challenging and kind of difficult and assertive as I am could be a good boy. I get where my thinking was, if you follow me. And that continued on for many, many years. And by the time I hit puberty, I realized that nature was bigger than me and that I had a problem, that everybody knew me as this kind of tomboy. And it was much deeper than a tomboy, though. It was an extremely definite, consistent, persistent, and insistent identity. And I didn't know how to get out of it. And I felt a bit embarrassed because I realized all the adults had been pandering to me and they'd been indulging me. And I had thought I was taken seriously. And then there's a kind of reckoning that happens between 3 and 10 years old. You start realizing the big world. And I realized, so all this nodding along was actually just pandering. I didn't have those words, but I understood it. And I didn't know how to get the hell out of my gender issues. I didn't know how to kind of re-identify as a girl and present as a girl again. I didn't know how to, and it was very, very, very difficult for me. And I had a hard time. I did eventually come out of it, and I'm now happy and comfortable in my own skin. I went on to marry and I had children. And I'm very glad I wasn't offered puberty blockers at that age, because had I would have swum the 7 seas to get puberty blockers. And it wouldn't have been appropriate for them, because it would have stopped my puberty, it would have stopped my sexual awakening, it would have stopped my growing body, and I would have concretized that identity that I was so sure of at 10. And by the time I was 20, I'd moved beyond. And it turns out, as I now know the research around gender, that 80% of kids are pretty much like me. They grow out of it. If they're just left alone, if they don't go to psychologists, if they don't go to therapists, if they don't go to clinics, they'll grow out of it. And that is shocking when you start realising, but lots of children aren't being allowed to grow out of it because they've been given puberty blockers, they've been brought to clinics, and actually that space to just become themselves in a gender non-conforming manner isn't being given to them. Anyway, many years later, I became a psychotherapist when I was about 30. And then I was a writer as well, and I've written a few books on mental health and parenting. And I was aware that I had a contribution to make with the gender discussion that was arising. So by around about 2015, 2016, I was noticing it was in the paper a lot, it was in the media. And I was like, I don't see where people like me were, because I wasn't just a tomboy. I was something very extreme, and I'm not seeing that in the media. And when I released my book in 2017, I thought to myself, one of my books, Bulletproof Kids at the time, I thought I'm going to have to make my narrative known because it's not being noticed in the media. And I wrote an article, and as a result, I was requested to make a film. And the film is told for trans kids, it's time to talk. There I am.
Is that you in the middle?
Yeah, I'm in the middle. And I was about 8, I'd say there, about 8.
It's a fascinating watch, and I'll actually put a link to it so viewers can watch that documentary, because it is.
And there's some pictures in that documentary of me, different pictures like that one, you know what I mean, where you wouldn't be able to spot me in the family photo because you'd be going, that's a boy. You can't actually see which is the girl if you follow me, because I look so like a boy. But, that was cool back then because it was much more live and let live, funnily enough, in terms of gender, and you could just present as you wished as a kid. Kids were free to be kids. If you look at Lego in 1980, and if you look at Lego now, you can see how genderized we've become as a society, how conforming. You're either pink or blue, which are you? And if you're not, you should be medicalized. It's a really regressive message that is cloaked in a progressive kind of wrapping paper. It's regressive to the depths of its soul. So yeah, I did that film in 2018, Trans Kids, It's Time to Talk, and I was shocked because the premise of the film was that I'm a psychotherapist, and could it be that any of the 4,000% rise in females presenting with gender issues, female children, in the largest gender clinic in the UK, could any of them be me? And I was told that was a transphobic question, let alone why is there 4,000% rise? What is going on that there is a 4,000% rise? And without a doubt, of course, some of those kids are like me. Of course, some of those kids are very much like that me. And I want to point out that 70% of children who are gender non-conforming grow up to be gay or lesbian or bisexual. So there's a huge issue around blocking sexual development with puberty blockers, when actually if you allow them to develop, they will realize I'm not a boy or a girl, I'm actually just a lesbian or a gay person, and I'm just gender non-conforming. And I wish we could create a society that was free, where boys could wear dresses and girls could walk around in whatever they wanted.
Well, we may have already got to that stage as part of this gender trend. Look, just before
we haven't, because thank you, they're my books.
Yeah, I want to highlight your books, because I mean the titles themselves, Fragile, Cotton Wool Kids, Bully-Proof Kids. I mean, that's real positive guidance for parents. Did you write those as a parent or as a psychotherapist?
As a psychotherapist, but I am a parent, and I'm all about empowering parents, because I think it's very important that we acknowledge that parental authority has been undermined, and it hasn't gone well as a phenomenon. This undermining of parental authority is being seen in many different countries in terms of gender, because an awful lot of parents feel that experts know their kids better than they do, and I'd like to remind parents that you're the world expert of your child. And that actually, I don't think many people will know your child better than any parent. And that parents need to kind of regain their authority and their self-respect. And I say this as somebody who's worked very deeply within parenting and mental health industry. And I'm aware how people kind of almost dismiss the parents' words, when actually you most parents, not all parents, but most parents care about their children more than anybody else. And most parents care about the long-term health of their children more than everybody else. And so we need to give some kind of freedom back to parent as they wish to parent, within reason. There's always going to be extremes. And I know you and I probably don't agree, and I know you probably have more traditional Christian values than I might have, but that's how a progressive society works. We discuss things. We can live with the fact that we don't agree. We don't fall over and collapse.
And that was one of the interesting things. That was one of the interesting things about your documentary, was that you showed a public meeting where you were going to discuss these things, and of course it got shut down virtually because of this quite raucous group outside who were almost violent. It was quite interesting to watch, but not much different from what we have here. I mean, groups over here cannot actually even book venues or hold meetings because of the protest. So the discussion has been shut down on this, hasn't it?
It's a tragedy. When we're living in a world where discussion is being shut down, we're going into really toxic underground where people are secretly kind of meeting. It's not appropriate. It's not the right way for a civilized society to live. But I just want to say about that meeting was being held by middle-aged women who were mostly liberal, left-wing, an awful lot of lesbians, very much kind of save the rainforest, had been kind of, protesting for various CND and things like that all their life. And what they wanted to discuss was women's rights. And these very young, 20-something, privileged students tried to shut it down. And they tried to shut it down because they didn't want middle-aged women to speak about women's rights. And they didn't want middle-aged women to speak about whether vulnerable women in prisons should be forced to share a cell with male-bodied trans women who still have, their genitals, who haven't had any operations, and who could still rape their cellmate. So, this was really quite serious that they tried to shut it down. They tried to do a smoke bomb. They tried to ruin the equipment. We had really good equipment in there because it was Channel 4. It was a high-end documentary. And they tried to sabotage the equipment. It was really chilling to see this extraordinary middle-aged, privileged entitlement that thought we would have, that they should shut us down. It was really awful. And I was absolutely thunderstruck by it.
And it was 3 years ago, and it hasn't really changed since then. So since then, there seems to be two organisations that I picked up. There's this Gender Dysphoria Support Network.com, and I've just put those websites so people can check them out. And then, of course, Genspect, which is the one that you have formed. Can you just tell us about those two organisations?
Very much, and you did them in order, because Gender Dysphoria Network is what I first established. And I established that because we were in COVID. I'd spoken to parents. After the film, I was contacted by many, many people very concerned about gender. I spoke to lots of trans people who were lost in transition. They were in a very difficult place. They had maybe transitioned, 5-10 years ago, and they were feeling very, very complicated feelings about it. I also spoke to a lot of detransitioners. These are people who transitioned and then reversed, and they detransitioned back because they weren't happy, because once they transitioned, they realized, like Alexander the Great, when he conquered the world, he sat down and cried. When they got to where they wanted to go, they realized it hadn't made them happy. It hadn't been the solution that it was promised to be. And so, and by the way, I've also part of the IATDD, which is the International Association of Therapists for Desisters and detransitioners, because these people need a lot of help. These people who have transitioned and then transitioned back. And so the reason why I started the GDSM, the Gender Dysphoria Support Network, was because during COVID, I was asked by parents, is there any chance you could run some meetings for parents who believe their children aren't receiving the most appropriate treatment for their gender distress? And I said, okay. I didn't have time before COVID, and when COVID came, I suddenly had loads of time. I said, yeah, okay, I'll run these online meetings. And within days, the first meeting turned into 2 meetings a week, 3 meetings a week, 4 meetings a week. And I realized there was an extraordinary number of parents from all over the world, from New Zealand, from Australia, from America, from Canada, from Europe, from Scandinavia, from England, from Ireland, all saying the same thing, all saying that they're quirky, shy, awkward, socially awkward, very often autistic, very often very anxious child had become transfixed by the idea that they could become a different person, that they could transition and have a new identity, and that new person would be socially kind of an absolute success. They'd be kind of like the YouTube sensations that they see on YouTube, that they were going to be really happy, and once they transitioned, they'd be able to leave behind their anxiety, leave behind all their social awkwardness, and instead they'd be this new identity. These are very naive, gullible kids, and the parents of these kids were flocking to our meetings saying, these kids have got 8 diagnoses, 3 diagnoses, 2 diagnoses, and gender dysphoria is just one of them. And yet gender dysphoria is kind of trumping all the other diagnoses, and that's not appropriate. And it's given these kids a false solution that won't work out in the long term, because parents are more interested in the long term than children or many other people. And we formed the GDSM. It was very big very quickly, and I realised, oh my God, we have to do something bigger. All these parents are being silenced, and they're from all the countries all over the world. And so we formed Genspect about last July. It's huge already. It started so big, so fast, so quickly. Why? Because there's thousands of parents, as it says, 17 different organisations in 15 different countries. All parents, all saying the same thing, which is our awkward children are not getting high quality treatment for their gender distress. Rather, they're being fast-tracked onto a medicalised route when there's no thought and there's not enough, basically, quality analysis about what is the most appropriate treatment for these children who have many diagnoses. They don't just have one.
So I sent through some of the latest stats from New Zealand, which we'd just released, and which found that, there's been about a 400% to 700% increase in the number of kids being diagnosed and being referred to clinics in New Zealand over the last 5 to 6 years. But one thing I noticed really interesting was that if you look at the diagnoses for gender dysphoria, they build up and there's this mass explosion around the 15 to 19 age group. And then as soon as you get to 20, it just drops off completely. The number of diagnoses in the last recorded year were 4 to 5 times higher in the 15 to 19 age bracket than beyond 20 years old. What happens at 20 years old?
They become less suggestible. They become more experienced in life, become less gullible, less naive. These are very naive kids who spend a lot, and I would argue too much time online. And this is an online phenomenon. It's very much internet driven. This would not be happening without the internet, because the internet is, if you look at for example, the rise of high-speed Wi-Fi and smartphones from 2012 onwards, most people had smartphones. Most people had access to Wi-Fi. You look at the numbers, they correspond exactly. This is really, really directly interlinked with these gender issues, are directly interlinked with the internet. But it seems to me that beyond the age of 20, the world expands. They move beyond their bedroom. They start having a life. They start maybe having sexual relationships. They start exploring all the different things of life. And they lose the simplistic idea that changing their gender identity will save them. Now, I've no doubt that for some people, they wish to transition, and they're going to wish to transition forever, and they may take that choice. And I believe in a free society, so I think they should be free to take that choice. I don't want to vilify anybody. But I'm not interested in a world where we foreclose on children's fertility, and where we foreclose on children's ability to have orgasms in the future before they even know what an orgasm is, because we're medicalizing their identity before it has fully formed. Because the teenage brain and the child's brain, it's not fully formed. Neuroscience tells us it's not fully formed until they're 25. So why would you be making decisions about your fertility when you're 14? Why would you be making decisions, or even allowed to make decisions, about your ability to orgasm and have a sex life when you're 13 or 14 and you don't actually know on what you're deciding? They say this is informed consent because they've read about it. I just don't think it's enough. I know I was told, as a kind of slightly freak quirk of nature, I was told that I was probably infertile when I was 25. I laughed about it. I didn't care. Didn't care less. 7 years later, I was like this earth mother who's breastfeeding, and I was mad about it because that's normal. Because when we get older, we care about having children. We don't care about having children.
So one of the terms that has come up in the discussion has been this ROGD, which the politicians sort of said, oh no, that's not really a case. Rapid onset gender dysphoria. It's this transgender trend or fad that we're seeing, which is being influenced by society. I guess if you had been subject to that, I would be speaking to Brian O'Malley, wouldn't I?
Yeah. It's shocking, and I've met many people who kind of say, I had a childhood like yours, but I transitioned because I was born at a different time. So Kira Bell and I know each other. Kira Bell, she took a case against the Tavistock, which is the largest gender clinic in the UK. And she took a case because she said, I was a very troubled kid, came from a troubled background. I was lost. And when I arrived at the clinic as a lost kid, they affirmed me as a boy. She was born a girl. She had a very similar childhood to mine. They affirmed me as a boy. They prescribed me drugs very quickly. I took cross-sex hormones. I had a mastectomy. And by the time I was in my early 20s, I regretted it. And I have, she has permanent facial hair. She has a mastectomy. She has a masculinized voice. And so she took the case not to make any money because there was no money. It was just literally to create a review of what's going on in the Tavistock because she feels that the children there are not receiving quality care. And so it's shocking when I've met so many detransitioners, and I really have met many of them, and so often we look at each other saying, we had similar childhood, we had similar feelings, and I lived in a different era, and so I was free to just become the person I was, without any medicalisation of my identity.
And one of the witnesses at Kira Bell's case, now she won the first case, she lost the appeal, going back to the, Supreme Court?
Supreme Court now.
So they are going...
She won the first case, and then it went, the case is ongoing.
Yeah.
And I think justice will be served in the end because it's appalling how she was treated. That's my own view, but...
And one of the witnesses was Dr. John Whitehall, who's an Australian paediatrician who has written a couple of articles for us. And, one of the points that he makes is that the problem is that kids are being asked, do you know what your gender is or what is your gender? It's a binary, pardon the pun, binary answer, yes or no. And yet he says, the problem is that if you are going to analyse whether somebody has got gender dysphoria under the DSM, it's not a tick in the box. You're going to be looking at a number of factors that have been over a period of time. It's far, kids are diagnosing themselves, basically. That's what he is saying, and yet it's far more detailed than that. I guess the question for you is that... So this 80%, we hear this, 80% revert back to their biological sex because they go through puberty and puberty reinforces biology. But there's that 20%. So what is the solution for them?
Well, you see, this is very interesting because these are very, these are of all the tests, of all the studies that have ever taken place for children over the last, 50 odd years, all the research for children, it shows that 80% of children grow out of it. Now, these are 80% of children who are so gender dysphoric they're at clinics. They're in clinical trials. They're really the extreme end of the edge, if you follow me. For example, I was never brought to a psychiatrist. Why? Because I grew up in Dublin and no kid was at the time. It just wasn't done.
Too tough for psychologists. You're too tough for psychologists.
Yeah. But nobody in my era or background were being brought to psychiatrists for things like that. And so they weren't in the studies. I just want to point out these were really quite extreme cases and also very invested. But so some of the cases, as many as 87, some are 90%. It's a rough figure that it comes in and around 80% is the rough figure. We don't know about the other 20%. Do they go on to transition? Some of them do. Some of them remain with gender dysphoria. It's very interesting that the future research will point what will happen with those kids. I do think those kids need to be helped, but that doesn't mean that we foreclose their identities. I think there's a lot of ways to alleviate mental pain. There's an awful lot of people who have conditions that get diagnosed in childhood, but it isn't medicalised to an extreme degree until they're adults because of fertility and because of other issues. So other children might get diagnosed, or they might, have signs of quite serious conditions. And yet still we preserve their childhood because they might grow beyond it. And so we have to remain kind of very vigilant, look after their distress. I lived through it. You can alleviate the pain. There's lots of ways to alleviate pain. Psychotherapy is one of them, but there's many other ways to reduce distress in children. It can be done. You don't have to pretend that this is some kind of weird and unusual condition that nobody in the world can deal with. We can deal with these things. There's terrible, terribly hard conditions that are much more difficult, that really, really require a lot of attention, and we still kind of alleviate the pain in the recommended ways.
Now, when you made your submission, one of the things that raised the eyebrows of some of the politicians was that you talked about the suicide factor, because generally what we're told is we need to adopt the gender-affirming approach, because if we don't do that, if we don't let the young people and the kids identify the way they want to and give them their preferred pronouns and let them go on puberty blockers, they will commit suicide. And none of us want that. And you made an interesting statement in your submission where you said, well, maybe you tell us.
I'd love to talk about that, because I feel when we talk about suicide, we need to be accurate, because this is a really serious, probably the most serious issue you could deal with, which is suicide within childhood. It's just a tragedy. And so we have to be very, very careful and very, very accurate if we're to give a good, respectful discussion around it. And the fact is, there is no research that suggests that children who aren't affirmed will turn to suicide. And in fact, as the Tavistock says, which is the largest, as I said, largest gender clinic in the UK, suicide on their waiting list is extremely rare. That's the quote, it's extremely rare. Now, sadly, suicide sometimes happens amongst children. It's a tragedy and should always be kind of in every way try to prevent it. However, you have to do it in the right way, and you have to make sure you've got the right research. And it's been a shock that recently leading figures from WPATH, and WPATH is the World Professional Association for Transgender Health, and they're very pro the affirmative approach. Their entire existence is to kind of medicalise and to kind of promote the transgender identity. Yeah,
and we have a unit at Waikato University which pushes that affirmative model.
And that's their identity. They promote transgender health, and they promote medical transition of children and older. Now they have come out. Eric Anderson, who's part of WPATH, and Marcy Bowers, who was the surgeon who worked with Jazz Jennings, who's the most famous trans child in the world, who grew up to become a trans woman. She was basically transitioned socially from the age of 3. And Marcy Bowers, the surgeon from WPATH, who did, perform surgery on Jazz Jennings, is now saying actually, what you said is it becomes sloppy. And she's basically suggesting they've gone too fast, too soon. Laura Edwards-Leeper, who's the chair of the Adolescent and Child Committee of WPATH. So these are the people on their own side who are very pro-trans. They have said there's no research to suggest that suicide is an issue here. That's a false narrative. It's a false narrative. People used it as a way to convince other people that we should agree with them.
So the narrative seems to come out. The narrative seems to come from surveys of kids who say that they're not sure of their gender, and then they ask, well, how do you feel mentally and socially? And of course, they paint this terrible picture. That's
online self-monitored surveys, self-reported online surveys is where this has come out of. And it's not about dying by suicide. And the latest, if you wanted to get the stats, the best stat would be from Sweden, where they did a kind of a 20-year analysis of who died from suicide from what conditions. And they brought in psychosis and schizophrenia and bipolar and some really serious conditions. And then they've also brought in autism, gender dysphoria, anxiety, different things. And gender dysphoria was in the lower end. Gender dysphoria wasn't up there with schizophrenia and psychosis and the more serious conditions. And so you can see actually dying by suicide is what you have to look at for the kind of, to get the real kind of facts of what's going on. Because self-reported online surveys aren't reliable, and it's too serious a subject to mess around with. We've got to go to the serious research when we're talking about that subject.
Yeah, and unfortunately, that suicide is that claim is used as a weapon, though, to shut down any dissent to the
Yeah.
gender affirmative model. You've look, we're just about out of time, but I do want to just refer to this document which you've just released. Is that correct? I just saw it
Yeah.
online, so I read it over the last couple of days, and in fact, I've sent it on to some medical professionals around New Zealand for them to be aware of. What is your baseline guidance for medical professionals dealing with this issue and psychotherapists?
I'll tell you what our baseline. We have a series of 7 guidances. We have them for families, for parents, for schools, for mental health practitioners, for psychotherapists. And, you know, what our basic guidance is, gender dysphoria is a condition. There are many mental health challenges that we face. And making gender dysphoria this special condition that has special rules doesn't help vulnerable children. What we need to do is realise that we're well equipped in helping children. If you're working in this field, you probably have experience, or certainly you're gaining experience and training in working with distressed children. Gender dysphoria is a different type of distress, but it's no more different than anxiety, autism, many of the other challenges that mental health practitioners are working with.
Do you think it's similar to anorexia nervosa in terms of the disconnect between the way you see yourself physically and your mental approach?
Yeah, there's huge links, and there's huge kind of similarities in the cohort, insofar as they're very often high achieving. They're very often perfectionistic, anxious. So there is a certain kind of similarity, and there's a kind of a grip. Do you know what I mean? It becomes a grip in their mind. So you could say it's very like the way eating disorders manifest. It's also like OCD, because it's stuck in a thought, and you know what I mean. And it's kind of rumination all the time. And it's also like body dysmorphia, because a child might fixate on their breast or fixate on another part of their body, and that feels like body dysmorphia, which is when you hate one part of your body and become obsessed with that one part. So it's like a combination of those type of conditions. It's no different. It's just it's just got huge numbers at the moment, but it's a mental health condition like many others.
So just finally, what is your advice for parents? There'll be parents watching this, and some may have children that are wanting to identify as the opposite sex. They want to use preferred pronouns. They don't want to wear the school uniform. They actually want to go on puberty blockers. And there's been this huge debate in New Zealand around the conversion therapy bill, because the Minister of Justice that was bringing in this bill was asked, can a parent tell a 12-year-old child, no, you cannot go on puberty blockers? Is that conversion therapy? And both the Prime Minister and the Minister of Justice couldn't actually fully answer that in detail. The suggestion is it is a form of conversion therapy by not adopting the gender affirmative model, which is going down the transgender path. So what's your advice to parents facing this dilemma right now?
Sadly, it can be conversion therapy the other way, because lesbian kids can end up, transitioning to being a boy when actually they should have been just allowed to grow up and become a butch lesbian. However, my advice to parents would be to go slowly, to join Genspect.org or other like-minded organisations.
You've already got Kiwi parents as part?
Oh, we do.
Good.
Absolutely, loads of them.
Well,
Sadly.
that's a worry, sadly,
Loads.
yes.
Yeah, and loads from Australia, loads from New Zealand. To inform themselves and to build a community and make sure that they start. We have a brief guidance for parents in Genspect, and I think read the brief guidance, realise this is a time where you go slow, because the child is in a hurry, and your job as a child, as the adult in the room, is not to go at the child's pace. Just because the child is in a hurry doesn't mean you respond in a hurry. What it means is you keep a cool head and make sure that you lean in with love and structure. Lean in with love and structure and watch the internet use, because it's bound to be an exacerbating factor.
Stella, we really appreciate your time. We thank you that you made the time to make a submission as well to our politicians, and we'll certainly keep directing people towards your organisation, because I know that parents are crying out for help. In fact, schools are as well, because they're sort of in the middle of this social dilemma. They've been told they've got to use pronouns and think about unisex toilets, etc. It's full on at the moment, isn't it?
It's really hard. We have a guidance for schools as well, because the schools just want to do right by the child and they don't know what's going on. And also we have a webinar, an ROGD webinar, which just discusses, I often call it the condition that dare not speak its name, because everybody's trying to suppress this phrase ROGD. Because once you read about it, you might recognise your child, and it opens up all sorts of questions about social contagion and about how your child is being influenced. And it's quite scary when you read about ROGD, so I really recommend people either go to the webinar or read up about it. Okay. It is, what we want to do, I just want to say to finish, what we want to do is help kids in the most compassionate way we can and make sure that they have options as an adult, that they can make adult decisions. And the way we do that is by caring for them with love and with structure.
Well, if this has raised an issue, there's the website, genspect.org. Well worth checking out, some fantastic resources. Stella, thank you for your time, and I'm sure we'll stay in touch because this is a live, ongoing issue, and we really appreciate your interest in New Zealand and support of Kiwi parents. So thank you.
Thank you. Kia ora.